Arla Valen had always believed herself above humans. They were a primitive species, clinging to their fragile, oxygen-rich world, squabbling over petty resources while barely scratching the surface of interstellar knowledge. As a member of the Xantherian High Court, Arla's role was to oversee diplomatic relations between her people and lesser civilizations like theirs. It was a duty she despised but carried out with calculated precision, her porcelain blue skin and delicate, angular features betraying none of her disdain. Yet nothing could have prepared her for the unmitigated disaster that was Marcus Kane. The human strolled into the ornate halls of the Xantherian embassy aboard the orbital station Seraphis Prime with the swagger of someone utterly oblivious to his own mediocrity. He was tall for a human, his shoulders broad beneath a fitted dark blue diplomatic uniform, his hair a mess of dark waves that looked as though he'd styled it with his fingers moments before walking in. His eyes, a vivid green, scanned the chamber as if he were assessing a sports arena, not the hallowed chambers of one of the most advanced species in the galaxy. Arla's sharp gaze locked onto him as he approached her, a lopsided grin on his face that only amplified her irritation. He had yet to say a word, but already she loathed him. "Ambassador Valen, I presume," he said, his voice smooth and tinged with the slightest hint of mockery. He extended a hand, a gesture Arla recognized as a human custom, though one she found utterly ridiculous. Handshakes. How barbaric. She ignored the gesture, her icy tone cutting through the space between them. "You are late, Mr. Kane." "Call me Marcus," he said, unbothered by her cold reception. He retracted his hand and shoved it casually into his pocket. And traffic was murder. Ever try navigating through a Clerian asteroid belt with a pilot who's afraid of sharp turns? Her expression remained stoic, but inwardly she seethed. The Xantherian delegation does not tolerate tardiness. Your inability to manage your own travel arrangements reflects poorly on your people. And here I thought this was a diplomatic mission, not a lecture, Marcus shot back, his grin widening. But hey, if you're handing out grades, at least tell me where I stand. C-? B+? Arla inhaled sharply, her irritation bubbling dangerously close to the surface. "This mission is of critical importance, Mr. Kane. Our objective is to secure a treaty that will stabilize trade routes along the Theta Expanse. If you insist on treating this as a joke, I suggest you return to Earth and leave this to professionals." "And miss out on the chance to work with you?" "No way," Marcus replied, his tone light but his gaze sharp. "Look, I get it. You're not exactly thrilled about teaming up with a human, but like it or not, we're stuck with each other. So why don't we skip the part where you pretend I'm beneath you and just get to work?" Arla's fingers twitched at her sides, her nails digging into the fabric of her robes. She wanted to argue, to remind him of his place in the interstellar hierarchy, but before she could speak, a soft chime echoed through the chamber. "Ambassador Valen," the AI voice of the station's central system intoned, "the council is ready for your briefing." Without another word, Arla turned on her heel and strode toward the council chamber, her ornate robes billowing behind her. Marcus followed, his boots clicking against the polished floor. The council chamber was a masterpiece of Xantherian engineering, an immense, spherical room with walls that shimmered like liquid silver. Suspended platforms hovered in the air, each occupied by representatives from various species, their holographic projections glowing softly. At the center of the room was a massive crystalline sphere, its surface alive with shifting images of galactic maps and data streams. Arla took her place at the Xantherian platform, her posture regal and composed. Marcus, meanwhile, stood awkwardly beside her, his casual demeanor suddenly subdued in the presence of so many alien dignitaries. "Ambassador Valen," said a deep, resonant voice. The speaker was a towering Craxian delegate, his insectoid form gleaming under the chamber's light. "You are accompanied by a human?" "This is Marcus Kane, a representative of the Terran Republic," Arla said, her tone clipped. "He will be assisting me in negotiations." The Craxian let out a low, clicking sound that Arla interpreted as disapproval. "Humans have little understanding of interstellar diplomacy. Why involve them in matters of such gravity?" Before Arla could respond, Marcus stepped forward. "With all due respect," he said, his voice calm but firm. Humans have a knack for finding solutions to problems that seem impossible. If you'll give me a chance, I'll prove it. The chamber fell silent, the various delegates exchanging glances. Arla fought the urge to roll her eyes. Marcus's confidence was maddening, but there was no denying that he had a way of commanding attention. Very well, the Craxian said after a long pause. But know this, human, failure will not be tolerated. Understood, Marcus replied, his tone unwavering. As the negotiations began, Arla found herself watching Marcus with a mixture of annoyance and grudging respect. Despite his irreverent attitude, he was surprisingly adept at navigating the complexities of interstellar politics. He listened intently, asked insightful questions, and even managed to defuse a heated argument between two rival factions. Still, Arla couldn't shake the feeling that his success was more luck than skill. Humans were unpredictable, impulsive, and prone to making reckless decisions. She resolved to keep a close eye on him, determined not to let his charm distract her from the mission. 2 weeks into the negotiations, disaster struck. The station's alarms blared as a fleet of unknown ships emerged from hyperspace, their weapons trained on Seraphis Prime. The chamber descended into chaos as delegates scrambled for safety, their holographic projections flickering out one by one. Ambassador Valen, we must evacuate, a Xantherian officer shouted, rushing to her side. Arla hesitated, her mind racing. The treaty was still incomplete, and if the station fell, the fragile alliance they had worked so hard to build would collapse. We can't leave, she said, her voice steady despite the panic around her. If we abandon the station, the treaty will be lost. And if we stay, we'll be dead, Marcus said, appearing at her side. Look, I'm all for heroic last stands, but this isn't the time. We need to get to the control room and figure out who's attacking us. Arla's first instinct was to dismiss him, but she knew he was right. Reluctantly, she nodded. Very well. Follow me. The two of them raced through the station's corridors, the sound of distant explosions growing louder with each passing moment. Arla's heart pounded in her chest, her Xantherian physiology struggling to keep up with the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Any idea who these guys are? Marcus asked as they rounded a corner. None, Arla replied. But whoever they are, they've chosen their target well. Seraphis Prime is the heart of this region's diplomacy. If it falls, the resulting chaos will destabilize the entire Theta expanse. Then we'd better make sure it doesn't fall, Marcus said, his tone grim. When they reached the control room, they found it in disarray. The central console had been damaged in the initial attack, and the station's defenses were offline. Can you fix this? Arla asked, gesturing to the console. Marcus examined the damage, his brow furrowed. Maybe, but I'll need time. Time is something we don't have, Arla said, her frustration mounting. Then you'd better start thinking of a plan B, Marcus shot back, already working on the console. Because if I can't get this thing running, we're gonna need one. As Arla watched him work, she felt an unfamiliar pang of something. It wasn't respect, exactly, but it was close. For all his flaws, Marcus was undeniably resourceful. Perhaps, she thought, there was more to this human than she had initially realized. But before she could dwell on the thought, another explosion rocked the station, and the control room's lights flickered ominously. Whatever was coming, Arla knew they would have to face it together, whether she liked it or not. The control room trembled again, throwing Marcus off balance as he crouched near the damaged console. Sparks spat from the jagged remains of its wiring, bathing his face in a ghostly, flickering light. His hands were steady, though, as he worked to reroute the power circuits. Sweat glistened on his brow, but his expression was focused, almost maddeningly calm. Arla, meanwhile, was anything but calm. Do you intend to take all day? She snapped, her sharp, melodic voice rising above the metallic groans of the station under siege. Her violet eyes darted toward the reinforced blast doors, behind which echoed the sound of distant gunfire. The attackers weren't content to batter Seraphis Prime from a distance. They had already breached the station. I'm going as fast as I can, Marcus shot back without looking up. Unless you've got a better idea, why don't you make yourself useful and monitor the sensors? Useful? You dare suggest? A sudden explosion ripped through the corridor outside, the force rattling the reinforced doors. Dust and fragments of the wall rattled loose from the ceiling. Instinctively, Arla moved to steady herself, but Marcus grabbed her arm and yanked her down behind the console just as a shockwave slammed through the room, scattering shards of glass and sending a console screen crashing to the floor. Marcus didn't release her arm right away. His green eyes met hers, their usual irreverence replaced by something startlingly serious. Get down when things go boom. That's a tip you can have for free. She wrenched her arm free, her skin burning where his fingers had touched. The indignity of being hauled to safety by a human was almost more than she could bear, but the chaos outside forced her to shove her pride aside. If you don't get the defenses online in the next 60 seconds, there will be nothing left to monitor, she hissed, trying to regain her composure. Marcus leaned back over the console, his hands moving faster now. 60 seconds? Plenty of time. I'll even throw in a miracle. Arla narrowed her eyes at him, then turned to the auxiliary control panel on the far wall. The readouts flickered erratically, displaying incomplete data on the station's hull integrity and the enemy fleet. Seraphis Prime wouldn't survive another sustained bombardment, not without its shields. Worse, the enemy's ground troops were moving through the station like wildfire. The Xantherian forces were vastly outnumbered. Arla tapped a few commands into the panel, trying to track the attackers. The enemy ships weren't broadcasting any identification, but their design was unusual, sleek, angular, with black hulls that seemed to absorb the light. They didn't match the profiles of any known pirate factions or rogue fleets. They were something new, something precise. This fleet, Arla said aloud, as much to herself as to Marcus, they're not just here to destroy. They're here to send a message. Marcus glanced at her. What kind of message? That they are efficient, calculated, superior. She turned to him, her expression grim. This isn't some random raid. This is an operation, and we're their target. Marcus sighed, muttering, oh great, so they're organized and homicidal. My favorite combo. The console he was working on suddenly flared to life, and the room's dim lighting brightened. Marcus stood up, wiping his hands on his uniform as though he'd just finished a routine repair job. Boom. Defense grid's back online. You're welcome. Before Arla could reply, the blast doors shook again. This time, a loud screeching noise followed as something began cutting through the metal. The doors were being breached. Can the defenses stop them? Arla asked, her voice sharp. Marcus shook his head. The shields are back, but internal security systems are toast. We're sitting ducks in here. A chill crept down Arla's spine as the screeching grew louder. The attackers weren't wasting any time. Her mind raced, calculating their odds. Staying in the control room was suicide, but retreating without a plan would only delay the inevitable. She turned to Marcus. Do you have a weapon? He raised an eyebrow. You mean other than my sparkling wit? She shot him a glare so cold it could have frozen fire. Do not make me regret tolerating your presence. Marcus held up his hands in mock surrender, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small plasma pistol. I like to keep things simple, he said, flipping it on with a faint hum. What about you? Do Xantherians even do combat, or do you just glare at people until they surrender? Arla's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. You'd be surprised. She drew a sleek, iridescent blade from within her robes. The weapon shimmered faintly, the air around it distorting slightly as though it were alive. This is a Clerian energy blade. Its edge can cut through reinforced alloy as if it were paper. Marcus let out a low whistle. Fancy. Just try not to hit me with it. The screeching at the door reached a crescendo, followed by a deafening clang as a circular section of the blast door fell inward. Beyond it, Arla caught a glimpse of the attackers, tall, humanoid figures clad in sleek black armor, their faces obscured by featureless visors. They moved with eerie precision, their weapons held in perfect alignment. Arla's grip on her blade tightened. Stay close, she said, her voice low. Marcus gave a mock salute. Yes, ma'am. The first of the attackers stepped through the breach, their weapon raised. Arla moved with a speed that Marcus hadn't expected, her blade cutting through the air in a blur of light. The energy blade hummed as it sliced cleanly through the attacker's weapon, and then through the attacker themselves. The figure collapsed, sparks flying from its bisected armor. Is that thing even alive? Marcus asked, his pistol firing at a second figure. The plasma bolt hit its mark, sending the armored attacker staggering back, but it didn't fall. They're augmented, Arla said grimly. Part organic, part machine. Perfect. Cybernetic zombies. Just what I needed today. The remaining attackers surged into the room, their movements coordinated and relentless. Marcus fired off several more shots, but it became clear that the plasma pistol wasn't enough to stop them. Any chance your magic sword can take out a dozen of these things at once? He called to Arla, ducking behind the console. It might, she replied, if I had a dozen arms. Well, in that case. Before he could finish, the station shuddered violently, the floor beneath them pitching to one side. The attackers staggered, their balance disrupted, and Arla seized the opportunity to strike. Her blade danced through the air, cutting down two more foes in quick succession. Marcus used the distraction to grab a fallen attacker's weapon, a sleek, alien rifle that seemed far more advanced than his pistol. Now we're talking, he muttered, firing a volley of plasma rounds that tore through the nearest enemy. Don't get cocky, Arla warned, her tone as sharp as her blade. We're not out of this yet. As the last of the attackers fell, the room fell silent except for the distant echoes of the station's continued bombardment. Marcus leaned against the console, breathing heavily. So, he said, flashing a tired grin, what's plan C? Arla didn't answer right away. Her gaze was fixed on the fallen attackers, her mind racing. This fleet, these soldiers, they were unlike anything she had encountered before. Whoever had sent them was playing a game far more dangerous than she had anticipated. Finally, she turned to Marcus. We find the leader of this operation, and we end them. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Just the two of us? Yes, she said, her voice cold and determined. Because if we don't, no one else will. The station groaned as another salvo rocked its failing hull, the vibrations sending thin cracks spidering across the ceiling. Emergency lights bathed the room in an ominous red glow, casting sharp shadows over the remains of the attackers Arla and Marcus had defeated. The air was thick with the acrid tang of burned metal and ozone, a grim reminder that time was running out. Marcus straightened, brushing the dust from his jacket as he surveyed the carnage. All right, fearless leader, he said, slinging the alien rifle over his shoulder. How exactly do you propose we get to their leader? These guys weren't exactly handing out invitations. Arla was already at the console, her fingers moving deftly over the controls. The interface stuttered and flickered, the damage to the station's systems making every command a struggle. She ignored Marcus's sarcasm, her focus unshakable. These attackers may be augmented, but their movements weren't entirely autonomous. They were receiving commands from somewhere. Marcus tilted his head, intrigued despite himself. You're saying someone's pulling the strings? Yes, Arla replied. And if I can trace the signal, she paused, her violet eyes narrowing as the console emitted a faint chime. A schematic of the station appeared on the screen, overlaid with a pulsating red marker. There. The command signal is being transmitted from one of the lower docking bays. Marcus frowned. Lower docking bays? That's a little too close to the station's core for my liking. If I were an evil overlord, I'd set up shop somewhere farther from where things explode. It's strategically sound, Arla countered. The core is heavily shielded. Any attempt to strike at their command structure would risk destabilizing the entire station. Let me guess, Marcus said, a smirk tugging at his lips. That's the part of the station we're heading to. Arla turned to face him, her expression steely. If you're frightened, I won't force you to come. Frightened? Marcus grinned, tapping the alien rifle. I just like to know when we're walking into a death trap. Helps me pace myself. Arla suppressed the urge to roll her eyes. Then prepare yourself, human, because this will be far worse than a death trap. The corridors leading to the lower docking bays were eerily silent, their once gleaming walls now scorched and pockmarked from stray plasma fire. The hum of the station's life support systems had grown faint, replaced by the distant rumble of explosions and the occasional groan of stressed metal. The dim emergency lights flickered sporadically, casting shifting shadows that made Marcus's skin crawl. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered, keeping his rifle raised as they advanced. "Feels like we're walking into a haunted house." Arla, her energy blade glowing faintly at her side, didn't respond. Her focus was on the path ahead, her mind calculating the fastest route to the docking bay while remaining vigilant for any ambushes. She had no intention of wasting time on idle chatter. The silence was broken by a sudden, sharp clang that echoed from a side passage. Marcus froze, his grip tightening on the rifle. "What was that?" he whispered. Arla gestured for him to stay quiet, her eyes scanning the darkened corridor. Her Xantherian senses were far keener than his human ones, allowing her to pick up faint vibrations in the air. Something, or someone, was moving nearby. "They're tracking us," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Well, that's comforting," Marcus muttered. "Any chance they're just here to say hi?" The answer came in the form of a metallic clattering noise, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy, mechanical footsteps. A trio of figures emerged from the shadows, their black armor gleaming even in the dim light. These attackers were different from the ones they had faced earlier, bulkier, with larger, integrated weapons and glowing red visors that pulsed in unison. "Fantastic," Marcus said, stepping back slightly. "They've got upgrades." Arla didn't hesitate. She surged forward, her blade cutting a brilliant arc through the air. The lead attacker raised its arm, a built-in energy shield springing to life just in time to block her strike. Sparks flew as the blade clashed against the shield, and Arla's muscles tensed as she pushed against the resistance. Marcus didn't waste the opportunity. He took aim at the second attacker, squeezing the trigger of the alien rifle. A burst of plasma rounds erupted from the barrel, striking the figure's chest. The armor absorbed the first few shots, but Marcus kept firing, and the barrage eventually punched through. The attacker crumpled, its lifeless body hitting the floor with a dull thud. "Two more," Marcus shouted, pivoting to aim at the third figure. The remaining attackers moved with unnerving coordination, their movements almost fluid despite their heavy frames. The second figure raised a massive, shoulder-mounted cannon, the weapon humming ominously as it charged. "Down!" Arla shouted, grabbing Marcus by the shoulder and pulling him to the ground just as a searing bolt of energy shot over their heads. The blast hit the wall behind them, disintegrating a section of the corridor and sending a shower of debris raining down. "That could have been my head," Marcus yelled, scrambling to his feet. "Focus, human." Arla snapped, her blade deflecting another strike from the lead attacker. She twisted her body with grace and precision, sidestepping a blow and countering with a swift slash that severed the attacker's weaponized arm. The figure stumbled but didn't fall, its remaining arm swinging toward her with brutal force. Marcus fired another volley at the third figure, but this one seemed to anticipate his movements. It dodged with surprising speed for its size, closing the distance between them. Marcus barely managed to sidestep a powerful swing from the attacker's clawed hand, the tips of the claws grazing his shoulder. "All right, no more Mr. Nice Guy," Marcus growled, reaching for the grenade clipped to his belt. He yanked the pin free and tossed it at the attacker's feet. Catch! The explosion was deafening, the shockwave throwing Marcus back against the wall. When the smoke cleared, the third figure was little more than a heap of twisted metal. Arla, meanwhile, had finally disabled the lead attacker, her blade driving straight through its chest. She pulled the weapon free with a flick of her wrist, the figure collapsing at her feet. For a moment, the corridor was silent again, save for the sound of Marcus's labored breathing. "You're insane," he said, leaning against the wall for support. "You're slow," Arla replied, deactivating her blade. "If I hadn't pulled you down, you'd be dead. And if I hadn't blown that guy to pieces, you'd be dead." Marcus shot back, a grin tugging at his lips despite the tension. Arla didn't respond. Instead, she turned and began walking again, her pace brisk. "We're wasting time. The command signal is close." Yeah, Marcus muttered, falling into step beside her. "You're welcome, by the way." The docking bay was enormous, its cavernous space filled with shadows and the faint hum of machinery. Dozens of sleek, black ships were docked in neat rows, their designs identical to those of the attacker's fleet. A single figure stood in the center of the room, its silhouette illuminated by the glow of a large, holographic display. The figure turned as Arla and Marcus approached, revealing a tall, humanoid form clad in the same black armor as the attackers. Unlike the others, however, this one's visor emitted a faint blue glow, and its movements were unnervingly smooth, almost graceful. "Well," Marcus said, raising his rifle, "I guess that's the big bad." The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying them. When it spoke, its voice was cold and mechanical, layered with an unsettling artificial cadence. "You are persistent. That is unexpected." Arla stepped forward, her blade ready. "Who are you? Why are you attacking this station?" "I am irrelevant," the figure replied. "What matters is the message. The galaxy must know that its so-called alliances are meaningless. Unity is a lie." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Okay, that's some greatest supervillain talk. What's your endgame, pal?" The figure's visor brightened. "You will see soon enough." Before either of them could react, the holographic display behind the figure shifted, revealing a countdown timer. 10 seconds. Arla's eyes widened. "It's a self-destruct sequence. They're going to destroy the entire station." "Of course they are," Marcus groaned. "Why wouldn't they?" The figure raised an arm, and the docking bay was suddenly filled with the sound of approaching footsteps. More attackers emerged from the shadows, their weapons aimed directly at Arla and Marcus. The timer ticked down. 9 seconds. 8 seconds. Arla's mind raced as the timer's red digits ticked downward, each second a death knell for Seraphis Prime. The self-destruct mechanism wasn't just meant to destroy the station. It would take out everyone on board, along with the fragile alliance they had worked so hard to build. And now, with the docking bay swarming with attackers and the puppet master standing in their path, the odds of survival were dropping by the second. Marcus, standing beside her, shifted his grip on the alien rifle. "So, Plan D," he muttered, his voice tinged with both sarcasm and fear. "Or is it E? I've lost track." Arla's jaw tightened. "There's no time to fight them all. We have to stop that timer." The puppet master, still standing at the center of the bay, tilted its head again as if amused. "You misunderstand," it said. "You cannot stop it. The sequence is locked. This station's destruction is inevitable." Marcus raised his rifle. "Yeah, well, so is your smug face getting blasted off." He fired, a bright burst of plasma streaking toward the puppet master. But before the shot could connect, a shimmering energy shield sprang to life around the figure, deflecting the blast harmlessly to the side. "Irrelevant," the puppet master intoned, its cold voice echoing in the cavernous bay. "Your resistance changes nothing." 7 seconds. Arla clenched her teeth. She didn't have time to analyze the enemy's defenses or come up with a flawless strategy. If they were going to survive, she would have to act on instinct. "Cover me," she said sharply to Marcus. "What? That's your plan?" Marcus exclaimed, but she was already moving. Arla surged forward, her energy blade flaring to life in her hand. The attackers opened fire, their plasma rounds streaking through the air. Marcus cursed under his breath, but immediately began firing back, laying down a chaotic hail of suppressive fire to distract the enemy. 6 seconds. Arla darted and weaved through the gunfire with the grace of a dancer, her movements so fluid that it seemed as if the plasma bolts were intentionally avoiding her. She reached the puppet master's shield and swung her blade in a wide arc. The edge struck the shimmering barrier, sending a burst of light cascading outward, but the shield held. "You're too late," the puppet master said. Its voice was calm, devoid of emotion. "Your struggle is meaningless." Arla ignored the taunt, focusing on the faint distortion patterns rippling across the shield's surface. Every defense had a weakness, and if she could just find— 5 seconds. "Arla, we're running out of time here," Marcus shouted from behind her. He was pinned down by enemy fire, his alien rifle overheating as he tried to keep the attackers at bay. She gritted her teeth. No more precision. No more careful analysis. It was time to gamble. With a feral cry, Arla raised her blade and drove it into the same spot on the shield she had struck before. Sparks exploded from the point of impact, and for an instant, the barrier seemed to waver. For seconds, Marcus saw the opening and didn't hesitate. He pulled a second grenade from his belt, yanked the pin, and hurled it directly at the puppet master. Heads up, tin can. The grenade struck the weakened section of the shield just as it flickered. The explosion was deafening, the shockwave tearing through the bay and sending debris flying. When the smoke cleared, the puppet master was still standing, but its shield had collapsed, and its once pristine armor was scorched and dented. 3 seconds. Arla didn't hesitate. She closed the distance in a blur of motion, her blade arcing upward. The puppet master raised an arm to block, but the energy blade sliced clean through, severing the limb. Sparks and hydraulic fluid sprayed from the wound as the puppet master staggered. Inevitable, it said again, its voice glitching. The cycle cannot be stopped. 2 seconds. Arla drove her blade into the puppet master's chest, twisting it until she felt the resistance of its core systems shattering. The light in its visor dimmed, and its body crumpled to the floor. But the timer kept ticking. 1 second. No! Arla shouted, turning toward the holographic display. The countdown hit 0, and for a single, agonizing moment, the station seemed to hold its breath. Then, instead of an explosion, the holographic display flickered and changed. The countdown vanished, replaced by an unfamiliar string of symbols that pulsed faintly before fading into static. What just happened? Marcus asked, stepping cautiously toward her. His face was streaked with sweat and soot, but his grin was still intact. Did we win? Or did the universe decide to give us a last-minute extension? Arla stared at the display, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. The self-destruct sequence, it was overridden. But by whom? Before Marcus could respond, the lights in the docking bay flickered again, and a new voice filled the room. This one was deep, resonant, and strangely calm. You have proven yourselves interesting. Arla's grip on her blade tightened. Who's there? The holographic display shifted once more, this time revealing a symbol, a black, jagged spiral set against a field of white. It was a symbol she didn't recognize, but something about it sent a chill down her spine. I am the architect, the voice said. This experiment was satisfactory. You have delayed the inevitable, but the larger game is still in play. Marcus frowned, aiming his rifle at the display as if it could help. Yeah, well, your experiment almost got us killed, you creepy bastard. The voice ignored him. Ambassador Valen. Marcus Kane, you have demonstrated potential. Consider this a reprieve. The next move is yours. With that, the display went dark, and the room fell silent. Hours later, the station's emergency systems had stabilized, and the remaining attackers had been neutralized. The surviving delegates had gathered in the main chamber, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and lingering fear. Arla stood at the center of the room, addressing the assembly with her usual poise. The threat has been contained, she said, her voice steady. But this was not a random act of violence. This architect, whoever or whatever it is, has a plan. And it will come for us again. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but no one voiced an objection. The destruction of Seraphis Prime had been narrowly averted, but the scars it left behind would not heal easily. After the meeting, Arla found Marcus leaning against a railing, staring out at the stars. He had cleaned himself up, though his uniform was still singed and torn. When he noticed her, he grinned. So, what's the verdict? Am I officially off the hook for being a primitive human? Arla raised an eyebrow. You were reckless, insubordinate, and irritating. But she allowed herself a faint smile. But effective. Marcus laughed, a genuine, warm sound that somehow cut through the weight of everything they had endured. I'll take that as a compliment. As they stood there, side by side, the stars stretching endlessly before them, neither spoke of the architect or the danger that still loomed. For now, they had earned a moment of peace, but both knew it wouldn't last. In the vast, uncaring void of the galaxy, the game had only just begun.